We at Dasra, working closely with adolescents, see it day in and day out with our on-ground programs. In fact, this week, we had people both from India and from other countries coming in to do an immersive visit at some of these programs in Jharkhand. And we'd love for you to, if you're in the room, to please share it with others that you network with and speak with today. But we basically had them see both the programs on the ground in action as well as interact with the boys and girls, the adolescent boys and girls that the programs are meant for. So it would be lovely to have some of those insights shared with the audience by the people. As we embrace new development challenges, it would be worthwhile to learn from sectors in India that have gained significant traction in the last 20 years. And that's exactly the objective of the next panel, the first panel of the day. Catalytic Partnerships, Reflections from Health and Education. May I please request the panelists to come on stage?
I'm just going to take this moment to introduce my esteemed panelists. I have with me Ashok Alexander. From 2003 to 2012, Ashok led Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, one of the largest private HIV prevention programs in public health. Today, he's the founder-director of Antara Foundation that works on maternal and child health in Rajasthan, and he's also the author of a fantastic book that I had the privilege of hearing excerpts from yesterday called A Stranger Truth. We also have with us Rizwan Tayabali. He is the CEO of Make a Difference. It's called MAD, which mobilizes young leaders to ensure equitable outcomes for children in shelter homes. And we also have with us a close partner, Abhijeet Mehta, the COO at Quest Alliance. He's had 18 years of experience working in the sector, all the way from supply chain logistics management to where he is today. So are we ready with our mics? And then, okay. Thank you. So today, this panel is the first one for Dasra Philanthropy Week 2019, the Mumbai leg. And today, the subject is an absolutely novel one, a revolutionary concept that we in this sector have never spoken about. Collaborative, catalytic partnerships, collaborative action. It's a bit of an inside joke. I'm sure all of you have been to a lot of conferences, a lot of panels, roundtables, where we've all discussed the need for partnerships, why we need to come together, why we need to partner, and why we need to collaborate. So I'm just going to address the elephant in the room. I know this is something that we've heard a lot of times across the years, across the sector, across so many areas, but I'm hoping that today's discussion dives deeper into getting us a few insights, goes beyond frameworks, and leverages the experiences of our panelists to be able to talk about why it's important, how does one enable partnerships, and what are some of the challenges towards it. Quickly, I'm going to begin with a bit of a set of responses from the audience. As you all know, we're going paperless this year at the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2019. So each of you all have access to our DPW 2019 application on your phones. Anybody who doesn't have it, put your hands up and download it right now. So when you open the application, you will see there's an event date, which is the 8th of March. Please go to that event. And at the bottom of that event is a tab called Live Polls. We're going to ask you to poll in a moment, so please go there and look at the live poll. And the poll that we have is, in your opinion, how critical are partnerships to deepen or scale impact? There are 3 options. Choose your option, and then we'll be on our way. Oh, okay. Okay, so it seems like everybody is a converted audience here. Everybody believes in partnerships. So then let me move to my panelists, and let me start with Ashok. I think the question that I have for each of you, just to get us all onto the same page, is how does one define partnerships? Or what do partnerships mean to you? Let me complicate it further. What do catalytic partnerships mean to you?
Thank you. I think you're right. The word partnerships tend to be overused and perhaps even bandied, and second only to the word catalytic, I suppose. But to me, a partnership is essentially two groups of people coming together, seemingly disparate, but coming together in common cause. They may separate from that cause and do other things afterwards, but the partnership works together. My own experience has been half of it with McKinsey and Company, and then working in HIV/AIDS, and then in maternal and child health, and going from partnerships of different kinds. My experience has been of three types of partnerships, and I would submit that all three are important if you're talking about scale, which I think we all are in this room probably. The first is partnership with government. I won't try to expand on these because I'm sure the discussion will come back to these, but that is a very, very difficult partnership to effect. In fact, a lot of NGOs walk away from that saying, no, we don't work with government. I don't think you can talk about scale without saying we will work with government. The question is the how and the wherefore of it. The second is a partnership with community. Again, very loosely talked about. A very difficult partnership to effect because it's not doing something for the community, it's getting to work with and through community and letting them lead. And the third partnership is the donor-donee partnership, which I'll be provocative here and hope you'll ask me more later. I often think today that's a perverse relationship of head versus legs. We have many, many examples of virtuous donor-donee partnerships, but by and large, I think that requires to be turned on its head.
Thanks. Abhijeet, do you want to take a crack?
So at Quest, I think we felt right from the get-go that partnerships was the way to go, and that's been codified in our DNA from 2005-06 when we started working in the education technology space in India. And we've always believed that bringing government, civil society, grassroots organizations, and technology companies was the way forward, and we've expanded the scope of that since then. And coming to your question of what makes catalytic partnerships, I think in all the work that we do, in all the trainings that we do with young people, with government officials at the cluster level, with our donors, with partners and NGOs that we work with, we always start with this question of understanding the self, because we feel that in order to really forge a meaningful relationship, a meaningful partnership, you have to be extremely self-aware, whether you're a young person entering the world of work or two large organizations trying to reach mutual understanding on how to collaborate. You have to understand yourself, and while you have to be self-confident about certain things that you may be good at, you also have to be vulnerable and humble about what you lack and what the other person is bringing to the table. So I would say that, if I were to share one big learning from our work on partnership development over the last 15 years, it is the fact that you have to approach the conversation keeping in mind the power dynamic that you're coming to the table with. And you also have to ask yourself if you are being self-aware about what your strengths are, but also where you can improve. And if that is a conversation starting point, then the chances of a successful partnership are greatly multiplied.
Okay, so I think from our end, we see the three, the different definitions of partnership. There's another one that we have here, what I try and think about is what I call a gateway partnership, which is where the partner is a gateway to the demographic that you're working with. And that's slightly different to a delivering partnership or a content partnership, or I guess in some ways a system partnership like government. And especially if you look at Make a Difference, we are still at that stage where we are still developing methodologies, we're still testing impact, we're still understanding the data side of it. So a lot of our challenges, a lot of our partnership focus is, obviously our delivery is not through the partner, but the partner is a gatekeeper or a gateway to the child that we are currently working with. So it's kind of an interesting mechanism where it still has a lot of the, you have to have a similar vision, you need the MOUs, you need to be, you need to understand what the give and takes are on both ends, but really the partnering organization, which in our case, all the shelter homes we work with, about 60 of them, they don't do any delivering. they just, have to support the work we're doing almost philosophically more than anything else. So we're kind of in a slightly different place when it looks at partnerships, but many of the same challenges apply.
I'd read somewhere an effective partnership is the individual plus courage multiplied by ambition and a big minus ego. And I think that's what I've heard some of you say today. But just, across your point around mutually beneficial partnerships, if I were to ask you, in your work, who have been your most catalytic stakeholders or the most catalytic partnership, or who have you partnered with and why? It would be good to kind of understand a little bit of who they are, how you've partnered with them, and why.
That's an interesting question, because I think we're at the stage we're at, we struggle actually even to engage with partners more than finding catalytic partners. And I think the reason for that in some ways is that for you to be able to make the most of partnerships coming into you and actually pushing your partnerships out to other people is that you need a level of resources, structures, teams, resources, capacity, capability in order to actually do that properly and make a difference in many ways. It's like a very large startup, kind of early stage. And one of the challenges that we face is we're almost not mature enough as yet to be able to access or to utilize catalytic partnerships in that sense. But it is definitely part of our developmental kind of trajectory towards scale and towards impact. So it's not so much a case of thinking that if we can't do it today, that means we don't do it at all or we find a different way around it. It's more about understanding that it is critical. And most of the journey of the last 5 years has been kind of building the resources and the capability to be able to engage in catalytic partnerships. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. From the three that I mentioned, I'd definitely pick the partnership with community. So I've spent a lot of my time, 15 years in public health, partnering with sex workers, partnering with women who work in brothels and homes and on the street. But that sex worker partnership taught me a lot about partnership. What do I mean by that? When we started working in HIV/AIDS, we thought that we would go and tell the sex workers that you have to use condoms, otherwise you'll die. The sex workers we found were telling us that we know all about condoms, and that's our trade. Why don't you help us deal with the issues that are most important to us? And when we asked, that was violence. Now, I couldn't figure out what was the connection between violence and safe sex. But when it became obvious to me, some words came out of my mouth, which I think I was the first and last person from McKinsey & Company who's ever said these words, which I don't know the answer to this. So how can I possibly do this? And it's when the sex workers laid out in very clear terms a very simple methodology to fight violence, the program went viral. The program resulted in a very rapid scaling up. They devised then many other ways of working. It was a partnership. We didn't stand aside. We bought, if you like, business frameworks to this. They bought intelligence, savvy, charisma, and much more. There's a second partnership I'm working on, which is now we work with pregnant and lactating mothers and the frontline workers of government, a conjoint partnership in very remote villages of Rajasthan. And we've started working with adolescent girls. None of the scaling up we're talking about could happen without working with community, not for community, with and through and being, if anything, the junior partner in the relationship.
Yeah, and Abhijeet, just coming to you, I know Quest works a lot with fellow nonprofits. It would be good to understand, because I think that is also one of the stakeholder partnerships that isn't often talked about. And while we all talk about it, that we must accept and understand there is competition. There's competition of resources, finances, people, and skills. So it would be good to hear from you on how Quest manages that, or what are the challenges.
Sure. So working with civil society organizations and fellow nonprofits has probably been our longest partnership engagement journey. Way back in 2009-10, when we were looking to create or co-create a blended learning ecosystem for vocational training, the only access point that we had, because of the way Quest had structured itself, was to work with civil society organizations who would be our partner on the ground to take the content that we were developing and ensure that it reaches young people who were looking for jobs. And that journey really taught us a lot about how we need to really look at partnerships, especially with civil society, as co-creators and co-owners of a process that maybe is counterintuitive for them, because digital learning, blended learning, mobile learning today is, we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution and things like that. These are, you may feel sitting in your offices in Bangalore and Delhi and Bombay that, how does a grassroots organization really understand some of these concepts? But I think it's really critical, and that's something we learned very early on, that, how do you involve them in that process? How do you build that co-ownership? And how can you allow for those ideas which may seem counterintuitive to you to filter into your content design, into your approaches of deploying, say, a technology tool solution, for example. So I think that journey for us has really been extremely humbling, and it has taught us the most in the last 10 years in terms of being able to really keep our ears to the ground and making sure that what we are creating as content creators or as curriculum designers is of value to a large number of organizations who will then become champions of that content or champions of that approach and philosophy. So the only way we realized very early on to do that was to, one, be very open and honest about what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's similar to what you said as well. And we saw that the moment we approached the conversation from that standpoint, the entire power dynamic changed. And I think I find it really surprising how little awareness there is about this power dynamic, whether it's between an NGO and a funder, or even between NGOs as well. And lastly, I'll just say that it's also about being okay to allow people to take what you have created and make it their own. I think there's a lot of resistance, across the board about, what if they change something? What if they, adapt this and, put their own label on it? And from the early days of Quest, we've always been very comfortable, and we encourage NGOs that we work with to make their own meaning of whatever we create. And I think that's really important if you have to see whatever you're doing evolve, adapt to local contexts, especially in a country like India.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And just as we round up, because we're going to also open it up for Q&A to the audience, and Rizwan, as we were talking earlier this morning, you were talking about having a level of maturity, you need resources, funders need to recognize that partnerships take time, effort, and finances. What's next? I know Matt wants to venture into more formal partnerships. What's up?
So yeah,
next?
if you look at the journey of system change, which is governmental change, for example, one of the key components there will be either regulatory change or policy change that then has to filter back into implementation through system players. Now, one of the challenges that, the way I try and look at partnerships isn't just a scaling mechanism, but it's almost like a learning pathway. Because the methodology that we have, for example, is still kind of hard-coded to the delivering framework that we use. And part of that process of working with delivering partners is about also refining and increasing the adaptability and flexibility of the methodology that you have, so that by learning how other players have to deliver different kinds of capability, different kinds of environments, different kinds of technology that's available to players. And I think if you don't go through that process, it's difficult to create sensible implementation policy when you come to a system change end. So when you're then pushing government to then implement or change the way, I guess, say for example, schools or Anganwadis or shelter homes or any of these things operate, then unless you've gone through a journey of working with multiple different types of delivering partners, your content and the delivery mechanism is unlikely to be flexible enough to really adjust to the variations in, especially a geography as big and as wide as India. So the challenges that I guess we face in many ways is talking to funders or talking to the financing end, being able to get backing to set those infrastructures up.
Sure. And Ashok, I know you have looked at many partnerships across your journey. What have been your roadblocks?
Yeah, so I've had the benefit of, giving away a lot of money with the Gates of Foundation and scrambling around for a little money with my NGO. So, when I started the Gates Foundation, we were spending huge amounts of money from Seattle and then from India, with the notion that the foundation knew very well what it needed to get done. And people would scramble to, fill RFPs and then deliver exactly to the requirements of that RFP. In other words, in some way, it occurred to me that this is the head and those are the legs. And it was not a virtuous partnership. So when working in HIV, which is a very complex area of public health, I often only had a rough idea what we wanted to do, and I would ask the NGO, what do you think should be done? You work in this area, you've been doing it for years. Do you have an idea that we haven't even thought of? And the look would be either a blank look or a surprised look, and sometimes a look saying, yes, exactly, I was hoping for someone to say that. I think this is changing. Organization like Dasra is just the one that's trying to create a virtuous partnership, but this head and legs thing still happens. And that's not for anyone's good. Working on the work I'm doing in Rajasthan, I had an idea for scaling up maternal and child health delivery. A little bit of a way out idea. I went and met the Tatars who'd never worked in maternal and child health. But they listened, they understood some or most of it. Then we went to a politician, Vasundhara Raje, and explained something. She probably broadly understood it. In other words, the implementer went and found the donor and then went and found the government. The donee became the donee, the whole thing was turned on its head. Now, what if an implementing agency has a completely novel idea? You may never find a donor who's thought of that. How do you find recourse to philanthropic capital? Donors come in with preconceived notions and donees who will implement faithfully. I'm exaggerating a little to make a point, but we need to think about reversing this paradigm, in my view.
Yeah, no, thank you. And now we are opening up to the audience for any questions that you have. Please introduce yourself by your name and the name of your organization, and do direct your question to one of them or all of them.
Hello, thank you. My question is for Mr. Abhijeet. I'm working with Barefoot College Education, and we're working to provide digital skills for students in rural areas. And the challenge we face is the only technology in these villages is the technology that we provide. So I'm curious what your inputs would be, or your experience with how do you, I guess, prepare students from rural villages to become digitally literate without having technology in the villages. So.
Sure. So this has been our experience as well, for the last decade, in terms of how do you bring in aspects of digital literacy or digital fluency to young people or teachers in places that lack infrastructure. And I think what we've tried to do is, one, work with those communities to understand what sort of low-cost solutions we could leverage, and really being more inventive about the way we look at digital literacy ourselves, and not be too tied down to notions that we started that process with. I think what's happened in the last few years is there's a whole host of offline content that's available that's pen and paper and doesn't really need any digital device. That speaks about the aspects of digital literacy. One of the things we do, for example, very quickly, is we look at how can we teach coding using pen and paper, and there's very easy ways to do that, making it a fun and engaging activity. So I would say it's, again, a process of working with the local partners, working with the community to understand how you can do that, and also seeing how they can have some sort of limited access to technology as well to supplement that knowledge. And we can talk more offline as well.
And one quick question, I think there's a question from upstairs as well. We have time for one last question, and then you can, of course, meet our panelists outside and continue the discussion with them. Is there a question this side? Yes? Yes, can we? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm Dhruv Khaitan from Khaitan Family Office. We talked of cooperation and collaboration. I'm specifically referring to cooperation and collaboration between NGOs. Now, in the for-profit corporate sector, competition is defined as, market share and being successful in the market at the cost of your competition. In NGOs, I suppose the competition is competing for funds. Now, if there are two NGOs, both of whom are competing for funds, how do you manage to, practically speaking, get them to actually cooperate, share best practices, come on a common platform? Because each of them is actually competing for money. And the better one gets the money, you know, your example of RFPs. So this is my question to all of you.
Let me answer that from my experience very quickly. In the private sector, where I spent half my career, this is understandable, that you have to squirrel away knowledge and guard it fiercely. That's very rational behavior. It unfortunately happens, as you pointed out, Mr. Ketan, in this sector, people have precious knowledge and they don't share it. And there are reasons why they don't share it. Sometimes it's the worst kind because there's a competitive proposal. But I've been around India, for example, rural creches. I've discovered about 11 organizations who do that, who don't know of each other. The reason organizations don't share knowledge and collaborate in partnership is, one, because they're not aware they're sitting on knowledge. Second, they don't know how to collate the knowledge. Third, they don't know how to transmit the knowledge. And then sometimes they don't have the business savvy to say, if we get together, we'll actually have a winning proposal. So creating a knowledge network is just a much needed thing for this sector as a whole. Or pan-Indian knowledge network, which is self-serving in many ways.
Can I add to that? Just I think also it's a philosophical thing at a non-profit end. I think you'll see much more today. Non-profits are beginning to understand that it is much better to just be open with what you have and what you know and share it, because it's not it's kind of not a zero-sum game. And certainly it'd make a difference. Everything we do is kind of open source, it's open available, it's Creative Commons. And I think we are noticing a lot of the partners that we work with have exactly the same philosophy. So even though you might be, I guess, competing for resources, really you're applying for funding. And because it's not like a Dragon's Den thing where you are directly competing against people either. So I feel like it's sometimes I think people assume that it's a very prevalent issue, but it's not something that we have struggled with massively. And certainly in our case, we go out of our way to make sure everything is openly available to anybody else that wants to use it.
Thank you. And we've run out of time, so thank you very much to my panelists for the engaging conversation, and just to the entire set of audience and our partners here, please continue conversations on collaboration, cooperation, and partnerships. And I'll just end with a quick quote. If your dream is only about you, it's too small. So please dream big. We have big ambitions to, goals to reach. So thank you.